Have you ever stopped to think that what you believe to be the truth might just be a language game? Do our words truly reflect the real world, or are we trapped in a maze of meanings we've created ourselves? And what if philosophy itself is not the solution to our dilemmas, but rather a problem caused by language? Ludwig Wittgenstein, one of the most enigmatic and revolutionary thinkers of the 20th century, believed that most philosophical problems were not actually about the world, but about how we use language to describe it. He didn't just question the meaning of words. He tore down and rebuilt the very way we understand human thought. His work influenced fields ranging from logic to politics, from psychology to computer science. He began his career trying to define the absolute limits of what can be said, but by the end of his life he argued that meaning doesn't lie in words themselves, but in how we use them in everyday life. He was one of the few philosophers who had the courage to destroy his own theories and start over from scratch. If you think language is just a neutral tool for communication, get ready to change your mind. In this video, we're going to explore how Wittgenstein revolutionized philosophy and made us realize that we might all be playing different language games without even noticing. Now let's dive into who this man was, why he gave up his fortune to dedicate himself to philosophy, and how he arrived at one of the most radical ideas of all time. Ludwig Wittgenstein was not an ordinary philosopher. His life was marked by extremes: wealth and renunciation, war and contemplation, genius and solitude. Born in 1889, he came from one of Austria's wealthiest and most influential families, surrounded from childhood by intellectuals and artists like Gustav Mahler and Johannes Brahms. His father, Karl Wittgenstein, a steel industry tycoon, expected his children to be brilliant and successful, creating overwhelming pressure within the family. 3 of his brothers committed suicide, and the shadow of tragedy would follow Wittgenstein throughout his life. Despite his sophisticated environment, Wittgenstein showed no interest in his family's wealth or prestige. He began his studies in engineering in Berlin and later moved to Manchester, where he started working with aerodynamics and jet engines. However, an unexpected encounter with mathematical logic changed his destiny forever. After coming across the works of Gottlob Frege and Bertrand Russell, he realized that his true questions lay in the philosophy of language. Without hesitation, he abandoned his engineering career and moved to Cambridge, where he became a student and later one of Russell's greatest obsessions. Russell, one of the greatest logicians of the 20th century, was struck by Wittgenstein's intensity. His approach to philosophy was not academic, but visceral. He did not merely want to understand logic. He wanted to solve all philosophical problems once and for all. On one occasion, Russell remarked that Wittgenstein had the expression of someone who was either a genius or a madman, and in a way, he was both. His perfectionism bordered on obsession. He spent sleepless nights consumed by philosophical questions, rejected all distractions, and despised any form of superficial living. When World War I broke out, Wittgenstein did not hesitate to enlist in the Austro-Hungarian army. Unlike many intellectuals of his time who sought to avoid the war, he insisted on being sent to the front lines. He faced brutal battles and narrowly escaped death multiple times. Yet, amid the chaos of the trenches, he began writing the work that would change the course of philosophy, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He believed he had solved all philosophical problems and that, after this book, philosophy would have no reason to exist. When the war ended, Wittgenstein followed this belief to the letter. He donated his vast inheritance, dressed in simple clothes, and withdrew to a modest life as a schoolteacher in remote Austrian villages. Wittgenstein's life as a teacher was just as intense as his philosophy. He treated his students with extreme rigor, often using methods considered too aggressive for young children. His explosive temper and impatience made him a feared figure and eventually pushed him away from teaching. Disillusioned, he distanced himself from philosophy for a time and lived in seclusion, building wooden houses and trying to lead a simple life. But despite his attempt to abandon philosophy, it never abandoned him. When he returned to Cambridge in 1929, he was no longer the same man who had written the Tractatus. His worldview had changed drastically. He began to see flaws in his own theories and, in the following years, worked tirelessly to deconstruct everything he had once believed. Wittgenstein's philosophy underwent a profound revolution, and he shifted from being a relentless logical thinker to a critic of the very idea that language should follow a rigid structure. Now that we understand a little about Wittgenstein's restless and intense mind, we can dive into the first phase of his thought, where he sought to define the limits of what can be said, and for a moment believed he had solved all philosophical problems once and for all. Imagine a world where language is a perfect reflection of reality. a world where every word corresponds to an object and every sentence represents a fact about the world in a precise and irrefutable way. This was Ludwig Wittgenstein's ambition in his first major work, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. He believed that by understanding the structure of language, we could finally solve the great philosophical riddles. Or more radically, realize that many of these riddles were merely illusions created by the misuse of language. Written amidst the brutality of World War I, the Tractatus is not an ordinary book. It lacks traditional arguments, lengthy explanations, or everyday examples. Instead, it consists of numbered statements, almost like aphorisms, each logically and relentlessly connected to the next. The book begins with a statement that seems simple, yet hides a universe of implications. The world is everything that is the case. For Wittgenstein, the world was not composed of objects or mysterious substances, but of facts, states of affairs that can be either true or false. If a fact can be described, then it can be expressed in language. If something cannot be put into words, then it simply does not belong to the realm of what can be logically thought. Here, his famous picture theory of language is born, the idea that language functions as a logical mirror of the world. Just as a map represents a territory, language represents reality. This view seemed to offer a definitive solution to philosophical problems. According to Wittgenstein, many of the questions that plagued philosophy, such as what is truth, logically, what is the mind, logically, what is morality, were not, in fact, legitimate questions. They were merely linguistic errors, illusions created by words used outside their proper context. When someone asks, what is the mind? They are treating the mind as an object, as if it were something physical that could be identified, when in reality this question makes no sense within the logical structure of language. And then he reaches his most radical conclusion, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This phrase, the last sentence of the Tractatus, encapsulates his view on philosophy. For Wittgenstein, philosophy should not concern itself with metaphysical speculations or abstract debates about existence, God, or the nature of the soul. If something cannot be expressed with precision, if it cannot be logically verified, then discussing it is meaningless. This, of course, had a profound impact, especially among the members of the Vienna Circle, a group of philosophers who sought to eliminate any trace of metaphysics from philosophy and turn it into a purely scientific discipline. The problem, however, is that this view was extremely restrictive. By limiting language to what can be logically represented, Wittgenstein inadvertently discarded much of what is essential to human experience: emotions, ethics, art, religion. If we follow the Tractatus to its ultimate consequences, it would be impossible to talk about love, beauty, pain, the existence of God, or any other aspect of life that cannot be reduced to a logical fact. Wittgenstein genuinely believed that he had put an end to philosophy with this work. After its publication, he left academia, renounced his inheritance, and lived a simple life, trying to engage in practical work far from the abstractions of philosophy. However, something continued to trouble him. Gradually, he realized that his own system had flaws. He began to see that language was not a fixed mirror of reality. It was something fluid, dynamic, alive. His return to philosophy years later would mark a radical shift in his thinking. The Wittgenstein who wrote the Tractatus and the Wittgenstein who emerged years later were practically two different philosophers. From that point on, he abandoned the idea that language should follow a rigid structure and began exploring an entirely new concept: language games. Wittgenstein was an unusual philosopher, not only because of his ideas, but also because of his courage to destroy his own convictions and start over from scratch. After years of living away from academic philosophy, something made him return. He began to realize that his rigid view of language, presented in the Tractatus, did not explain the complexity of how we use words in everyday life. He abandoned the idea that language was a logical mirror of the world and started seeing it as something far more flexible and dynamic. It was during this period that he developed one of the most influential concepts of the 20th century: language games. In his new approach, Wittgenstein proposed that language is not a fixed structure based on universal logical rules, but rather a collection of different games, each with its own rules and meanings. Just like in a game of chess, where each piece has a role and only makes sense within the context of the board, words only make sense within the context in which they are used. He argued that there is no single fixed meaning for each word. Its meaning depends on its use within a specific language game. To better understand this, think of the word truth. When a scientist says, "This is true," they mean that an experiment has been tested and empirically verified. When a politician says, "This is the truth," they may be trying to persuade their audience based on a narrative. When a poet writes, "This truth hurts," They are speaking about a subjective and emotional experience. In each of these cases, the word truth has a different meaning because it belongs to different language games. This idea has profound implications. It means that many philosophical debates and everyday discussions may simply be conflicts between different language games. Often, two people might be talking about the same word, but using completely different rules. One of the most classic examples of this is in the philosophy of religion, when a scientist says, "God does not exist," and a religious person responds, "God exists." They may be operating within entirely different language games. For the scientist, God's existence might be an empirical question, verifiable through experiments and evidence. For the religious person, God's existence might be a matter of faith and personal experience, not subject to the same scientific logic. With this vision, Wittgenstein broke away from a millennia-old philosophical tradition that had always sought fixed definitions for fundamental concepts. Instead of asking, "What is truth?" he suggested that we should ask, "How do we use the word truth in different contexts?" This shift in perspective moved philosophy away from a model that searched for universal essences toward an analysis of the everyday uses of language. This new way of thinking led Wittgenstein to another revolutionary insight. Language is not just something we describe or analyze, it is something we do. Speaking, arguing, naming, promising, ordering, laughing. These are all different language games. Just as a child learns to play soccer not by studying theoretical rules but by kicking the ball and engaging in the game, we learn language not by studying definitions but by practicing its use in different contexts. This turning point led Wittgenstein to reject much of what he had written in the Tractatus. If he once believed that the limits of language were the limits of the world, he now realized that the world is as vast as the different language games we play. Philosophy, rather than solving eternal problems, should focus on untangling confusions caused by the improper use of words. Wittgenstein spent his final years refining these ideas, writing endless notes, and discussing his concepts with his students at Cambridge. He never published a final book, but his reflections were compiled after his death in Philosophical Investigations, which would become one of the most influential works of the 20th century. The discovery of language games transformed the philosophy of language, but its implications extended far beyond. It influenced psychology, communication theory, computer science, and even politics. If language is not a fixed reflection of reality but a set of evolving rules within different contexts, then whoever controls language can shape how we perceive the world. This shift in perspective raised another profound question. Is it possible for a completely private language to exist, a form of communication understood only by a single individual? Wittgenstein devoted part of his philosophy to dismantling this possibility, arguing that the very nature of language requires a shared context. Wittgenstein's philosophy did not end with a definitive answer, but with a shift in perspective that forever changed the way we think about language, the mind, and reality itself. While he initially believed that language should be a logical mirror of the world, he later concluded that it was, in fact, a set of dynamic games, each with its own rules and meanings. His work not only revolutionized philosophy, but also influenced fields such as linguistics, psychology, computer science, and even political theory. If language does not simply describe the world but also shapes it, then the words we use directly affect the way we think. This idea has profound implications for public discourse, the media, and politics. When a government defines what can or cannot be said, it is not just imposing rules on communication, it is controlling the very perception of reality. George Orwell explored this idea in 1984 with Newspeak, a form of language designed to restrict thought by limiting available words. This concept echoes Wittgenstein's view that our thoughts are structured by the words and language games we have access to. We can see this influence in debates about speech and identity. Terms like fake news, post-truth, and hate speech are more than just expressions. They create categories of thought that shape how we interpret reality. Wittgenstein would warn us about the danger of assuming that a word has a fixed and immutable meaning. If the meaning of words is determined by their use, then the struggle to control language is in reality a struggle to control reality itself. This raises an essential question. Are we prisoners of language? If all our thinking is shaped by the language games we play, is there anything beyond that? Wittgenstein did not believe we could completely escape language, but he suggested that by becoming aware of linguistic traps, we could avoid philosophical and ideological confusions. Perhaps his greatest legacy was showing that many of the questions we ask in philosophy, politics, and everyday life might simply be the result of linguistic misunderstandings. When we debate concepts like justice, freedom, or truth, we are often not disagreeing about facts but merely playing different language games. The challenge is recognizing when we are trapped in these pitfalls and when we are merely repeating words without understanding their true use. At the end of his life, Wittgenstein did not offer a closed philosophical system, but rather an invitation to reflection. He encouraged us to see language not as a mirror of reality, but as a practical tool we use to communicate, create, and structure the world around us. His thinking reminds us that philosophy does not have to be an endless search for answers, but can instead be an attempt to dissolve confusions and see with greater clarity. So, do we really understand the language we use every day, or are we still, without realizing it, prisoners of words we believe we control? The answer, perhaps, does not lie in seeking an absolute truth, but in observing how we play this game. Wittgenstein did not leave behind a closed philosophical system, a definitive theory, or a set of universal truths. He left behind questions that do not demand a single answer, but rather a new way of looking at the world and at ourselves. His philosophy is not a map, but a mirror that forces us to see our own limitations, not just in what we think, but in how we think. If he was right, then language is not just a means of communication, but a battlefield where ideas, ideologies, and perceptions of reality collide. Every word we choose, every sentence we construct, every discourse we follow or challenge is, at its core, a reflection of the language game we are part of. This means that to truly understand the world, it is not enough to ask, what does this mean? But rather, how are we using these words? And here lies Wittgenstein's great provocation. Can we escape these structures? If we become aware of how language shapes us, can we truly think beyond its limits? Or are we forever playing different games without recognizing the rules that govern us? Perhaps philosophy is not about finding definitive truths, but about learning to ask better questions. If you've made it this far, it means you've joined me on this journey through Wittgenstein's thinking. And that, in itself, says a lot. In a world where we're bombarded with fast information, taking the time to reflect on language, thought, and philosophy is an act of resistance, and I appreciate that. Throughout this video, we talked about how words shape our perception of the world, how, without even realizing it, we are guided by language games that determine what we can express and even what we can think. But there's something Wittgenstein might not have foreseen. Language also connects us. When we discuss ideas, when we share thoughts, when we try to express what we feel, we are expanding the boundaries of our understanding. Every comment you leave, every question you raise, every reflection you carry with you after watching this video is part of a language game that transcends Wittgenstein himself. I could end by saying something like, thank you for watching, but that would reduce this experience to a formality. So I'll say something different. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for questioning. Thank you for being here. Now, I want to hear from you. What language game has been challenging you lately? Have you ever felt trapped by words that didn't quite express what you meant? Share your thoughts in the comments. And of course, if you want to keep going on this philosophical journey, you know what to do. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because here we keep exploring the questions that truly matter. But be careful. Maybe the answers aren't hidden in words, but in the silence between them. See you in the next video.